Hi everybody, Dr. Jay Brower here to talk to you about groupthink. Groupthink is a really interesting theory for lots of reasons, not least of which being that we can see it present in pretty much every aspect of group experience, at least to some degree. So overall, if we're just thinking in sort of overview terms about groupthink here, it is essentially the idea that when groups are highly cohesive, when people know each other, when they're friends with each other, when they have a desire to maintain their connection, that they fail to consider alternatives and as a result often make decisions, at least occasionally, that become problematic. And so some characteristics that lead to this condition of groupthink where the interests of the group outweigh effectively accomplishing their work. We see circumstances where there is a high level of consensus seeking and where that's valued over critical assessment of all the information that one might have regard to a given task. And this can lead groups to make faulty decisions because, again, there's just this overwhelming feeling that the group needs to work together, collaborate together, that any sort of tension or frustration between members is frowned upon, and so the group wants to continue its inertia, its momentum in reaching consensus at all costs. And so, when we think about a tighter definition of what groupthink is, it's a way of deliberating that group members use when their desire for unanimity, for unanimousness, overrides their motivation to assess all available plans for action. And so, again, we have here this concept of harmony in the group being the primary goal rather than an effective outcome of or to the group's work. So, groupthink was originally developed by Irving Janis, as you know from reading the chapter. And his interest was in understanding how policy decision making at the governmental level uh, was influenced by groupthink. And so he's looking historically at instances where groupthink was present and ultimately led to bad outcomes. So the first on this list here you see is the U.S. Navy's preparedness at Pearl Harbor. Historically, there is a sufficient amount of information to indicate that there were immediate and imminent signs that there was a Japanese attack being prepared on Pearl Harbor that ultimately commenced the United States participation in World War II. But there was this overwhelming sense amongst the naval command that Japan would never attack, that they had no interest in it, and so this desire for harmony and unanimity within the group prevented a real critical, hard look at the evidence that was manifesting and then seeing how that the two were in contradiction, the beliefs of the naval command and the evidence that was mounting pretty substantially that an attack was on the horizon. And this even goes so far as to point to evidence that a Japanese signal saying literally we're going to attack was broken by naval cryptographers, but that evidence was ignored. There's some historical debate about when that message was captured and those kinds of things. And so, if we go down to another example here, the Bay of Pigs invasion, when the United States backed Cuban rebels who landed in Cuba and attempted to overthrow Castro, it was a horrible success, or I'm sorry, a horrible failure. The rebels were quickly thrown back, many of them captured, and in retrospect, it looked like an awful plan, one destined to fail. But what Janice found in looking at the preparation at the governmental level of or for this attempt to overthrow Castro was that there was this sense, oh, it couldn't fail, it has to succeed. Why wouldn't it succeed? We'll of course win this action, and quite the opposite ended up happening. So, some assumptions of groupthink. The first is that conditions in groups promote a high level of cohesiveness, because without a level of cohesiveness, groups can't do their work. And so, when we see a high level of cohesiveness, this is really, in some ways, an attempt to fulfill the mission of the group by creating a strong working structure between members where people cooperate, where there are shared attitudes, values, patterns of behavior, those kinds of things. Um, Second, Group problem solving is primarily a unified process. So when we, as members of a group, strive to get along, more importance is placed on that cohesion, on that getting along, than on the task itself. And this fits with just our general understanding of how social interaction works. We're trying to fit in, we're trying to conform, we're trying to discharge our responsibility to other people. And then another component of this is that groups are susceptible to affiliative restraints. And by that, West and Turner mean the restraints of affiliation, of connection. So when two people, let's say in a group, are friends, they're less likely to want to challenge one another, even though they might not agree with the other person, because they want to maintain that connection, that friendship, more than they want to challenge the idea that's being put forward. And then third in this list of assumptions is that groups and decision making are frequently complex. The understanding that members have of each other, of their task, of what the ultimate outcome needs to be, and then thrown into the mixture of the context that the group is working in, and the task that they're trying to accomplish, become ultimately very complex variables. All right, so some conditions for groupthink. One is a high level of group cohesiveness. Second are structural factors. So the more that a group is isolated, for instance, and subsequently reliant on one another, the more likely that there's going to be a strong sense of cohesion and a lack of external critical input. Second is a lack of impartial leadership. So when you have a leader that is bound to follow a particular course of action, whether or not the group is necessarily supportive of it, that leads group members to often gravitate towards solutions that fit with a leader's either explicitly or implicitly desired outcome. And then third, as a component of these structural factors, is a lack of decision making procedures. So when there isn't a defined process for making decisions, this leads to groupthink because there's no even element of the process that can challenge the outcome of a highly cohesive group. And then third amongst these major conditions is group stress. So the more that a group is stressed, feels pressures being put upon it, it promotes insularity and a failure to question other possible solutions. Some symptoms of groupthink. First is an overestimation of the group, an overestimation of what the group can do, of their knowledge, of their capacity, of what they might be able to accomplish. Second is closed mindedness. So, again, like I was talking about in those last structural conditions, a resistance to alternative solutions, a focus on one goal from the very beginning that doesn't waver, and as a result of that doesn't take into account other factors that might contextualize decision making. And then third, pressure towards uniformity. We all have a very strong desire to conform as human beings living in society, and this carries through to groups, but even on a more micro focused level, because as members of groups, we're not just anonymous members of society, we're particular members in an identifiable group. All right, so some ways to prevent groupthink. First is to look at a range of objectives when you're a member of a group trying to solve a problem, rather than just say that there is one objective. There might be multiple objectives to look at. Second, develop and review action plans and alternatives. So not only develop one action plan, but a plan A, a plan B, and then what are some other alternatives to that. Third is require oversight and control, so have some procedures for decision making. Fourth, embrace whistleblowing in the group, and what this means is the idea of embracing people who have contrary views, who identify and call out where problems may exist. And fifth, allow for objection. So, along with whistleblowing, allow for alternative or contrarian perspectives. And then finally, balance consensus and majority rule. So, look for places where you can gain a high degree of consensus, where a substantial amount of the group agrees, and then also recognize where sometimes just a simple majority, 51%, is required and important. And that's all for groupthink.